when you played in America. I mean, there was an awful lot of characters. Tell them that story about Willie Johnston. We've got to hear it now.
Well, there was a minute to go, and it was 0-0, and it was going to go into overtime, this game. I think we were playing San Jose or something like that, really hot.
Most people hear the name Willie Johnston and think of one thing: Argentina, 1978. A failed drug test. A flight home in disgrace. The shame of a nation pointed at one man. But here's what those people don't know. 8 of football's greatest minds, men who played with him, managed him, competed against him, they tell a completely different story. So who was the real Willie Johnston? And why do legends like Kenny Dalglish, Sir Alex Ferguson and Brian Robson still speak his name with reverence decades later? That's what we're here to find out. Let's go back to the beginning. The mid-1960s. Ibrox Stadium, Glasgow. Rangers Football Club. One of the most pressure-filled environments in British football, where the fans don't just want you to win, they expect it. Willie Johnston arrived there as a teenager. Raw, quick, fearless in a way that even seasoned professionals noticed immediately. He had that thing you can't coach. The absolute certainty that he could beat any man in front of him, no matter how big, no matter how physical. Now, the reason that matters so much is because of who was already at Rangers. Willie Henderson. Henderson was the man, the primary winger, a crowd favourite who had been tearing fullbacks apart for years. Stepping into that role was not a small thing. Players who tried and failed at Ibrox didn't get second chances. But Johnston didn't just survive the transition, he thrived. Henderson himself said so. And think about what it means for a man to say that about the player who effectively replaced him. That's not bitterness. That's genuine recognition of quality. Henderson saw up close what Johnston could do with a ball at his feet, and he respected it completely. Then there's John Greig. If you know Scottish football, you know what Greig represented. He was Rangers' captain, a warrior, a man who held teammates to an almost impossible standard because that's what the club demanded and what he demanded of himself. Greig's respect for Johnston wasn't just about talent, it was about bravery. And there's a difference. Plenty of talented players crumble when the occasion gets too big. Johnston didn't. Greig watched him in the biggest matches, the derbies, the European nights, the games where an error cost you everything. Johnston wanted the ball. He demanded it. That nerve, that refusal to hide, was exactly what Greig valued in a teammate. So at Rangers, 2 very different men. The winger Johnston replaced and the captain who set the standard both arrived at the same conclusion. This was a special player. Now let's fast forward to May 1972. Barcelona, the Nou Camp. Rangers were in the Cup Winners' Cup final against Moscow Dynamo. And if you think the pressure at Ibrox was intense, this was something else entirely. European finals do one of 2 things to players. They reveal the ones who are never quite as good as advertised, or they confirm the ones who are the real thing. Willie Johnston was very much the real thing. He scored twice that night. Not lucky goals, not tap-ins from a yard out. 2 goals on the grandest stage Rangers had ever stood on, against a Moscow Dynamo side that was organised, physical and determined. Johnston went at them all night. Every time he got the ball wide, made something happen. Derek Johnston was in that Rangers side. Striker, the man who needed Johnston's deliveries to do his job. And Johnston was emphatic about what made Johnston so devastating to face, so valuable to play with. He called it delivery on a plate. Johnston's crossing was so precise, so perfectly weighted that strikers barely had to break stride. Ball just arrived exactly where it needed to be, at exactly the right moment. Think about what that means from a striker's perspective. Johnston had played with good wingers, but Johnston's delivery was different. It removed the guesswork. It gave strikers a genuine advantage because they could already be moving before the cross came in, trusting completely that Johnston would find them. That 1972 final didn't just win Rangers a trophy, it announced Willie Johnston to European football. Broadcasters across Britain and the continent watched him that night and understood immediately what Scottish fans had known for years. This was a winger of the highest order, precise, brave, brilliant under pressure. That reputation followed him. English football came calling. West Bromwich Albion, the English First Division. A completely different world from Ibrox and European finals in Barcelona. When Willie Johnston crossed the border and signed for West Brom, he wasn't just changing clubs. He was walking into the most competitive domestic league on the planet. The English First Division in the mid-1970s was the most watched football league in the world. Harder, more physical, less forgiving of players who relied on flair alone. A lot of Scottish players came south and struggled to adjust. Johnston didn't struggle. He thrived again, and the men who watched him do it couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. Tony Brown had been at West Brom for years by the time Johnston arrived. Bomber Brown, the club's heartbeat in attack, a goal scorer who understood, better than most, exactly what an attacking side needed to function at the highest level. He had seen good wingers. He had seen inconsistent ones. He knew the difference between a player who looked dangerous and a player who actually changed games. Johnston changed games. Brown was clear about that. He talked about Johnston's football brain, and that phrase means something specific coming from a goalscorer. It's not a compliment about tricks or pace. It's about decision-making, about reading a situation 2 moves ahead. A winger with a football brain doesn't just beat his man and hope for the best. He knows where the striker is before he looks up. He knows when to go early and when to hold. He knows when the cross needs to be driven low and when it needs to hang. Brown said Johnston's arrival transformed West Brom into one of the most exciting attacking sides in England. That's a big statement, but it tracks, because when you have a winger who thinks that clearly, every other attacking player around him gets better. The game opens up. Space appears that wasn't there before, and suddenly a team that was solid becomes a team that opponents genuinely fear. Make sure to like and subscribe, and now back to the video. Now, the interesting thing about Brian Robson is where he was in his career when Johnston was at West Brom. He wasn't the Brian Robson the world would later know, the captain of England, the heartbeat of Manchester United. He was young, still learning, still absorbing what the game looked like at the top level, and one of the players he was absorbing it from was Willie Johnston. Robson didn't use careful language when he talked about Johnston. He called him one of the most skillful players he ever shared a pitch with. Full stop. Think about the weight of that. Robson went on to play alongside some of the best footballers in the world. He played at World Cups. He played in European finals. He had every reason to be selective about who made his personal list the truly skillful. Johnston made that list without question. What Robson pointed to specifically was the delivery from wide areas, the crossing. That same quality Derek Johnston had described in the 1972 final. The ability to make a striker's job easier by putting the ball in exactly the right place. Robson saw that same precision every week in training and in matches at West Brom. He recognized it for what it was: world class. Then there's Johnny Giles, and Giles is a different kind of voice entirely. He wasn't a goal scorer like Brown. He wasn't a young player learning his trade like Robson. Giles was a football intellectual, a man who had played under Don Revie at Leeds, who understood the tactical side of the game at a level few professionals ever reach. When Giles spoke about a player, he wasn't talking about moments, he was talking about patterns. What Giles respected in Johnston was something rarer than pace or power. It was Johnston's ability to control the tempo of a game from a wide position. Most wingers influence a game when they have the ball. Johnston influenced it before he got it and after he'd released it. Giles recognized that kind of football intelligence immediately, because it was the same kind of intelligence he prided himself on. 3 completely different footballing minds. A natural goal scorer, box-to-box warrior in the making, a tactical genius. All watching the same player, all reaching the same conclusion. But while his club career was earning him new admirers south of the border, his international story was moving towards something far more complicated. Scotland, 1978, Ali MacLeod's squad. A nation that had convinced itself, genuinely convinced itself, that this was the year Scotland went to Argentina and showed the world what they were made of. The expectations were extraordinary, almost delusional in hindsight. But that's the environment Johnston stepped into when he boarded the plane for South America. And Kenny Dalglish understood exactly what Johnston brought to that squad. Dalglish was Liverpool's finest at the time, Scotland's most decorated player of that generation. A man who saw football with complete clarity, who understood what a team needed and what it lacked. When he looked at the Scotland squad, he saw Johnston as something irreplaceable. Because what Johnston gave Scotland was unpredictability, real unpredictability. Not the kind that comes from a player being inconsistent, the kind that comes from a player being genuinely difficult to read. Fullbacks who faced Johnston in Argentina couldn't settle. They didn't know if he was going to cut inside, go to the byline, or pull the ball back early. That uncertainty was a weapon, and Dalglish knew it. He valued it in a way that only a forward who had to work with wingers could fully appreciate. Johnston gave Scotland an attacking dimension that no one else in the squad could provide. Then came the Iran match, and everything changed. Johnston tested positive for Fenpropex, a banned stimulant found in Reactivan tablets he had taken for fatigue. He was sent home immediately, banned by FIFA. Scotland's campaign, already fragile, collapsed around the absence and the shame of it. The public narrative was brutal. One man, one test, one moment that defined everything. And for a lot of people outside that dressing room, that moment became the only thing they ever associated with Willie Johnston. Dalglish's perspective on it tells a different story. Not an excuse, not a defense of what happened procedurally, something more honest than that. Even after 1978, even after the fallout and the headlines and the ban, the respect Dalglish had for Johnston as a footballer didn't move. It stayed exactly where it had always been. Because Dalglish had watched Johnston play, he had seen what Johnston could do with a ball at his feet, what he gave a team, what he demanded of defenders. One failed test couldn't rewrite that. The players who had actually shared a pitch with him weren't going to let a headline replace the memory of what they had seen with their own eyes. That's the thing about dressing rooms. They have long memories. And what the Scotland squad remembered about Willie Johnston wasn't Argentina. It was the winger who gave them something nobody else could. And no one understood that contrast better than Sir Alex Ferguson. Ferguson's connection to Johnston goes back further than most people realise. Before Manchester United, before Aberdeen, Ferguson was cutting his teeth as a young manager in Scotland, and Johnston was one of the players he studied up close. He saw him not just as a supporter or an opponent, but as a student of the game sees a master craftsman, watching, learning, filing it away. What Ferguson talked about when he talked about Johnston was old-school wing play. He meant that as the highest possible compliment. Because real old-school wing play, the kind that was dying out even by the late 1970s, was one of the most technically demanding things a footballer could do. It wasn't about pace alone. It wasn't about tricks for their own sake. It was about the complete destruction of a fullback as a functioning defender. Ferguson was specific about how Johnston did it. He didn't just beat his man, he dismantled him psychologically before the ball even arrived. The way Johnston moved before he received the ball, the way he positioned his body to suggest one direction while committing to another, the way a fullback who had faced him for 20 minutes started to hesitate, just slightly, just enough. And that hesitation was all Johnston needed. And it went deeper than that. Johnston understood that a fullback's worst enemy isn't pace, it's doubt. So he manufactured doubt deliberately. A shoulder drop here, a slight shift of weight there. Small movements that forced a defender to commit early, to guess, to lean the wrong way. By the time the ball arrived, the battle was already won. Ferguson recognized that kind of psychological warfare, because it's the same thing he demanded from his own players decades later at Old Trafford. Get inside the opponent's head before the game is decided. Make them uncertain. Make them slow. Johnston was doing that naturally, instinctively, long before anyone had a tactical language for it. Now, pull all 8 of these men together. John Gregg, who demanded bravery and got it. Willie Henderson, who watched his successor and chose respect over resentment. Derek Johnston, who scored goals because Johnston's crossing made it almost easy. Tony Brown, who watched an entire team transform around one player's football brain. Brian Robson, who put Johnston on his personal list of the most skillful players he ever played with. Johnny Giles, who recognized a man who could control a game from wide areas in a way almost nobody else could. Kenny Dalglish, who saw an irreplaceable weapon that no headline could erase. And Sir Alex Ferguson, who studied Johnston's psychological mastery and never forgot it. 8 men, 8 different vantage points, 8 different reasons, 1 conclusion. Here's what makes that remarkable. These weren't men who were easily impressed. Gregg set impossible standards. Robson played in World Cups. Dalglish won league titles and European Cups. Giles dissected the game at a tactical level most footballers never reach. Ferguson became the most successful manager in the history of British football. For all 8 of them to point at the same player and say without hesitation he was something genuinely special, that means something. That carries weight. The 1978 story tried to erase all of it. One failed test, one flight home, one headline repeated so many times it became the only thing people remembered. But dressing rooms don't work like headlines. In dressing rooms, what you did on the pitch is what survives. And what Willie Johnston did on the pitch, from Ibrox to Barcelona to the Hawthorns, was good enough to earn the permanent respect of 8 men who had seen everything football had to offer. That's his real legacy. Not Argentina, this. Willie Johnston never got the send-off his career deserved. The noise of 1978 drowned it out, but the 8 men in this video made sure the real story survived. And now you've heard it too. In his prime, he was one of the finest wingers Britain ever produced. The legends saw it. Dressing rooms remembered it. It was always the truth, whether the headlines said so or not. If you think someone needs to hear this story, someone who only knows the 1978 version, send them this video. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe. There are plenty more legends waiting.
Bob was his number 2, and I was training, trying to get fit for this game, and I had a bit of a reputation. The Germans, particularly foreign teams, weren't so good in the air. I had a bit of a reputation of being useful against these teams, so I was trying to get myself fit, and he left me out.
Say the name John Toshack to a casual football fan, and they might picture a big, bustling centre-forward from a grainy Liverpool highlight reel. Say it to Kevin Keegan, to Kenny Dalglish, to Xabi Alonso, to Gareth Bale, and the answer you get back is something completely different. Because every single one of them at some point looked back at their own career and pointed to Toshack as the man who shaped it. He wasn't the loudest personality in any room he walked into. He wasn't chasing headlines or collecting television appearances, but from the terraces of Anfield to the Bernabeu, from Cardiff to San Sebastian, he left something behind in every place he touched, and the men who worked with him never forgot what it felt like. So what does it tell you when 8 footballing legends from completely different eras and completely different countries all arrive at the same conclusion about one man? That's exactly what this video is going to unpack, and the answer says something important about what real football intelligence actually looks like up close. John Toshack was born in Cardiff in 1949, and the route he carved through football didn't follow any obvious blueprint. Cardiff City gave him his start, but it was Bill Shankly who changed everything. Shankly brought him to Liverpool in 1970, and what followed was one of the most instinctive attacking partnerships the English First Division had ever seen. Alongside Kevin Keegan, Toshack didn't just score goals, he manufactured them, held up play with his back to goal, and pulled defensive lines apart with the kind of spatial intelligence that most strikers of his generation simply didn't have. But here's what's easy to miss. While Keegan became the poster boy, the European Cup winner, the Ballon d'Or recipient who defined an era, Toshack quietly moved into management and started doing something nobody had fully anticipated. He went to Swansea City when they were sitting in the 4th division and turned them into a First Division club in 5 years. Not with money, not with star players parachuted in from elsewhere, with structure, belief, and a football philosophy that was years ahead of what most British coaches were even thinking about. Then came Spain, Real Madrid, Real Sociedad, Deportivo, Besiktas, Wales, Porto. The list runs long and runs wide, across 3 decades and 4 continents, and at every single stop, without exception, he left behind players who would spend the rest of their careers describing him as the most influential coach they ever worked under. George Cohen's phrase for Ray Wilson was unobtrusive excellence. The phrase that fits Toshack is something closer to quiet authority, a man who didn't need to raise his voice because the clarity of his thinking was loud enough on its own. Players trusted him not because he demanded it, but because he'd already proven every time that he knew exactly what he was talking about. So why, decades later, do 8 of the greatest names in the game still reach for his name first? To answer that, you need to start at the beginning, with the man who first put him in front of the world. English football in the early 1970s was a physical game. Strikers were expected to run the channels, chase lost causes, and batter themselves against centre-backs who had no interest in playing nice. The job was simple and brutal. Most forwards accepted those terms. Toshack quietly rewrote them. He stood 6'1", which gave defenders one set of problems. But his real weapon wasn't his height. It was what he did with it. He understood space in a way that most players in that era couldn't quite explain, even when they were watching it happen in front of them. He didn't chase the ball. He positioned himself so the ball had to come to him. And when it did, the whole shape of the attack changed in an instant. Kevin Keegan described it as telepathic. That word gets thrown around a lot in football, but Keegan was precise about what he meant. He said there were moments in games where he hadn't even decided what he was going to do yet, and Toshack had already moved to exactly the right place to make it work. That's not instinct. That's reading a game 2 or 3 steps ahead, while everyone else is still processing the one they're in. Kenny Dalglish came into that Liverpool squad a few years after the partnership had hit its peak, but he saw enough to understand what made Toshack different from everyone else wearing red. Dalglish pointed to Toshack's hold-up play specifically, his ability to receive the ball under pressure, keep it, turn his marker, and set the attack moving again with a single touch. It sounds basic when you describe it. In practice, against the defenders who were trying to stop him, it was anything but. What both of them kept coming back to was the same quality, the calmness. Toshack rarely seemed hurried, didn't force things, didn't snatch at chances when the situation wasn't right. He had a striker's ego in that he absolutely believed he'd score, but he wasn't reckless with it. He waited, and when the moment arrived, he was already there. Xabi Alonso, who met Toshack years later at Real Sociedad, said the first thing he noticed in training sessions wasn't anything tactical. It was how Toshack moved around the pitch to demonstrate things, even well past his playing days. The body language was still that of someone who had spent years reading space professionally, an automatic, unconscious fluency that you can't teach and can't fake. Alonso said it quietly communicated something to every young player watching. This man had operated at the highest level, and he understood exactly what that required. That understanding is what carried Toshack from the pitch into the dugout without losing anything. The language was the same, only the role changed. Understanding Toshack's football intelligence in a training ground or a first division match is one thing. The real measure of any manager is what happens when the pressure becomes structural, when the job itself is almost impossibly large, when the expectations are unreasonable, and when failure is the most likely outcome. That test arrived for Toshack not at a World Cup, but at a club where the odds were stacked so heavily against him that most people in football quietly expected him to last 18 months and move on. Swansea City in 1978 were a 4th division club. No money, no reputation, no infrastructure that would make any ambitious coach look twice. Toshack looked twice. He took the job, brought in players he trusted, and began building something from the ground up with the same spatial logic he'd applied as a striker. Identify where the gaps are, move into them before anyone else notices, and let the structure do the work. What happened next still doesn't get the attention it deserves. Swansea went up, then up again, then again. 4 promotions in 5 seasons, arriving in the First Division by 1981 and eventually reaching 6th place in the top flight, high enough to qualify for European competition. A 4th division club, European football, inside a single decade. That is not a story about luck or timing. That is a story about a man who understood football at an architectural level and could translate that understanding into results under conditions that would have broken most coaches entirely. Gareth Bale and Aaron Ramsey were still children when that happened, but Toshack's name was already part of Welsh football folklore by the time he handed both of them their international debuts. Bale was 16, Ramsey was 17. Neither had come close to that level yet, and most coaches would have waited. Toshack didn't. He said later that he could see in both of them what Keegan had once described in Toshack himself, a reading of space and situation that was already operating ahead of their physical development. You back that or you waste it. Bale has spoken about that debut with consistent clarity across his entire career. The decision to trust him didn't just give him a cap, it changed his relationship with the game, the way he thought about what was possible, what level he was actually capable of reaching. Ramsey said almost the same thing, almost the same words, from a completely different position on the pitch. When 2 players describe an identical effect on their confidence from the same manager, that's not coincidence. That's method. John Terry faced Toshack's teams from the opposite end of the pitch, and what he remembered wasn't the players specifically, it was the shape. He said Toshack's sides always forced you into decisions you hadn't prepared for, not through pace or physicality, but through positioning. The spaces kept appearing in the wrong places. The press came from angles you didn't expect. He called it genuinely uncomfortable, the kind of tactical problem that stayed with you after the final whistle because you still couldn't fully explain how it had worked. That discomfort, the kind Terry was describing, doesn't come from drills alone. It comes from a manager who has spent 30 years thinking about space, movement, and timing, first as a player reading it, then as a coach engineering it. The language was always the same, the application just kept growing. There's a hierarchy of respect in football, and most people outside the game don't fully understand how it works. Fans give respect based on trophies and highlight reels. Journalists give it based on narratives and timing. But players, the ones who actually share a pitch with you or line up against you, give it based on something far more direct. They give it based on what you made them feel when the game was live and the stakes were real. That kind of respect is almost impossible to manufacture, and it doesn't fade with time. Emilio Butragueño was one of the finest forwards in Spanish football history, a man who spent the peak years of his career at Real Madrid watching managers come and go, watching ideas arrive with fanfare and collapse under pressure. When Toshack walked into the Bernabeu, Butragueño was already an established figure, someone who didn't need to be impressed and had every reason to be skeptical. What changed his mind wasn't a speech or a tactical presentation, it was the first week of sessions. The way Toshack restructured movement patterns in training with an economy of explanation that suggested he'd already solved problems Butragueño hadn't even identified yet. He said Toshack saw the game from a completely different altitude to most coaches he'd worked under. Not just what was happening on the pitch, but why the geometry of it kept producing the same results, and how to redesign it from the inside out. But that same directness that earned Butragueño's respect was cutting board members and journalists in half at the same time. Real Madrid's directors expected deference. They got Toshack instead. When the press asked him early in his first spell whether he thought he could win the league title, he told them that pigs would fly over the Bernabeu before that happened in his first season, a line that spread instantly and followed him everywhere. The board didn't find it charming. They found it inconvenient. The strange part is that it was honest. He knew exactly where the squad was, what it needed, and how long the work would take. He said so. That willingness to tell uncomfortable truths to people who weren't used to hearing them created friction that no trophy could fully dissolve, and it cost him. Even when the results came, the relationship with the hierarchy stayed uneasy. Players trusted him completely. The suits above him rarely did. Ryan Giggs experienced something similar, though from a national team perspective that carries its own particular weight. Wales, for most of Giggs's career, were a side that played within expectations. Competitive sometimes, limited by resources always, and never quite capable of making the leap that the talent on the pitch occasionally suggested was possible. Toshack pushed at that ceiling. He talked to Giggs not about what Wales were, but about what the structure of the game itself could offer a team willing to approach it differently. Giggs said it was the first time he'd heard a Wales manager speak in terms that matched the level of football he experienced at club level every week. That gap between what international football demanded and what most national coaches actually understood closed when Toshack was in the room. Xabi Alonso put it the most plainly of anyone. He said that very few coaches in his entire career made him think differently about positions he'd already spent years mastering. Toshack was one of them. Not because he introduced complexity, but because he stripped things back to first principles. Why you stand where you stand, why the angle matters before the pass is even played, why reading the situation half a second early changes everything that follows. Alonso called it a recalibration, a coach who didn't just organize players, but reorganized the way they understood the game itself. 7 down, 1 left, and the final voice carries the most weight of all. Kevin Keegan once said that the most honest thing about Toshack was that he never needed anyone to tell him he'd done something well. He already knew. And if he didn't know, he went away and figured out why and came back better. That self-contained quality, the ability to measure yourself against your own standard rather than the crowd's reaction, is what let him walk into a 4th division club without embarrassment. take a struggling national team without apology, and rebuild after failure without theatre. Because there was failure. Real Madrid ended his first spell after a single season. Wales ended with qualification agonizingly out of reach. Clubs in Spain and Turkey and Portugal produced results that didn't always match the ambition. Toshack never dressed those chapters up. He left when things were finished, reflected on what hadn't worked, and moved. No long farewell tours, no bitterness leaking out in interviews years later. He simply absorbed what each experience gave him and redirected it somewhere new. What his former players consistently noticed about him across every era and every country was that he treated football as a discipline rather than a performance. Training sessions weren't designed to entertain, they were designed to solve specific problems with the fewest possible moving parts so that the solution became automatic under pressure. Butragueño noticed it at the Bernabeu, Alonso noticed it at Real Sociedad, Bale noticed it on an international training pitch in Cardiff when he was still a teenager, trying to work out where he belonged. The method didn't change based on the audience, it was always the same underneath. Clear, direct, built around the logic of the game rather than the personality of the coach. The years after management have been quieter. No television career built on provocation. No hot takes fed to the press to keep the name in circulation. Toshack has given interviews, spoken at length when asked, and shown a willingness to be critical about the direction of modern football that reads more like a football man's genuine frustration than a pundit's performance. He says what he thinks, because he always has, and the people who worked closest with him point to that consistency as the thing they trusted most. He was the same man in front of the squad as he was in front of a journalist, as he was standing alone on the touchline watching his team struggle. That coherence is rarer than it sounds. The modern game, with its media training and carefully managed press conferences and coaches who say nothing for 40 minutes and mean even less, had no obvious place for someone like Toshack. He didn't pivot to punditry. He didn't soften his opinions to stay relevant. When the top jobs stopped calling, he didn't chase them. He stepped back without ceremony, the same way he'd always operated, on his own terms, without needing the room to validate it. That self-sufficiency, which had made him so effective inside a dressing room, made him easy to overlook once the cameras moved on. Football's memory is short, and it favors the loud. His legacy doesn't live in a single trophy or a single club. It lives in 8 careers that bent in a different direction because of a decision he made, a session he ran, a conversation he had at the right moment. Bale lifting the Champions League trophy, Alonso conducting the tempo of a generation, Ramsey scoring the goal that won an FA Cup final. None of them have forgotten where part of that came from. The greatest compliment in football isn't a statue outside a ground. It's when 8 men from 8 different eras and 8 different countries all sit down separately and reach the same conclusion without being prompted. Toshack never asked to be remembered this way. He just kept working, kept thinking, kept trusting the players others hadn't noticed yet. If you found something in this story that stays with you, leave it in the comments below and send some respect for a genuine football mind. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.
I'm thinking about 50 years, and we were great boys. Everybody was a great boy. If you've got the good lads, great. Dressing room is great. It's a great place. The great players, if you go back in time, and the Pelés and all the rest of them, they were all good guys.
82 years old, a World Cup winner's medal in the cabinet, a First Division title on the wall, and a face that half of Britain grew up watching on a Saturday morning. Ian St John saw it all. The muddy pitches of the Second Division, the roar of Wembley, the bright lights of ITV. He played alongside greatness, went toe-to-toe with it, and spent decades analysing it on television. So when a man like that tells you who he genuinely respects, you listen. Not the players he liked, not the ones who were nice to him at a dinner, the ones who actually earned it. He played with some of them, faced others, and watched a few from the terraces. But every single name on this list left a mark he never forgot. 8 legends, 8 very different reasons. Stay with us, because number 1 will surprise you. We start in 1961. Liverpool Football Club was stuck in the Second Division, going nowhere fast, when Bill Shankly made 2 signings that would change everything. One of them was Ian St John himself, arriving from Motherwell. The other was a giant Scotsman from Dundee United named Ron Yates, and that is where this list begins. Shankly called Yates a colossus, and he meant it literally. When the press came to see his new signing, Shankly told them to walk around him as if Yates were a monument rather than a man. St. John was standing there that day. He said later that was the exact moment he knew Liverpool were going to be something real. At 6'2" and built like a door frame, Yates dominated every penalty area he walked into. Wingers who fancied themselves brave would cut inside, take one look at what was coming, and think again. Centre forwards, who'd bullied defenders all season, found themselves suddenly crowded out, unable to get a clean touch, wondering where all the space had gone. Yates was the physical backbone of everything Shankly built, the wall at the back that let St. John and the forwards play with freedom. Don't score goals if you're constantly defending a 3-goal deficit. Yates made sure that never happened. He captained Liverpool to the First Division title in 1964 and lifted the FA Cup in 1965, and through all of it, played with a consistency that never seemed to waver. No histrionics, no drama, just a big man doing exactly what was needed, week after week after week. St. John respected him as the foundation of the whole structure, a man whose steady, unyielding presence made the dream possible in the first place. Now, Roger Hunt is a slightly different story, because the respect here is almost personal. St. John always insisted that a big portion of his own goal tally only existed because of Hunt's movement. Hunt would pull defenders in one direction, open up a yard of space, and St. John would arrive exactly where Hunt had predicted he would. That's not luck. That's football intelligence at a level most players never develop, kind that doesn't show up on a highlights reel and doesn't get celebrated at awards dinners. There was a connection between them that went beyond instructions. St. John would begin a run, and Hunt had already accounted for it, already drifted wide, already dragged the centre-back half a step out of position. Two strikers thinking as one. St. John said it felt less like a partnership and more like a conversation neither of them had to start. When Hunt pulled left, St. John went right without being asked. When Hunt checked his run, St. John knew to go long. That kind of understanding doesn't get coached. It just grows, slowly, over hundreds of matches and thousands of hours on a training pitch in Melwood. Hunt won the World Cup with England in 1966, stood in that dressing room at Wembley, and still spent decades being overlooked by the wider conversation. Part of that was timing. Playing alongside Bobby Charlton and Jeff Hurst meant the spotlight rarely found its way to Hunt. Part of it was style. He wasn't flashy, didn't chase individual moments, didn't go looking for glory that belonged to someone else. St. John called him one of the most underrated legends the British game ever produced. Coming from a man who saw that era up close, that judgment carries real weight. Two teammates, two completely different gifts, and both of them absolutely essential to what St. John became at Liverpool. Now we move away from teammates and into rival territory. This is where St. John's respect gets harder won. Liverpool versus Leeds in the late 1960s and early 1970s was not a football match in any comfortable sense. It was a confrontation. Tackles came in late, the crowd was hostile, and nobody on either side was interested in losing gracefully. Billy Bremner was the heartbeat of that Leeds side, a small Scottish midfielder with the competitive fury of someone twice his size. 5'5", ginger-haired, and absolutely immovable when he decided something mattered. And to Bremner, everything mattered. St. John saw himself in Bremner. The refusal to accept second place, the absolute conviction that giving less than everything was a form of dishonesty. You could knock Bremner over and he'd bounce straight back up. The look on his face when he did told you something, that going down hadn't cost him anything. He was already thinking about the next ball. St. John watched him drag Leeds through matches they had no right to win, simply through force of will, pulling teammates along by the collar when the game started to slip. Bremner led Leeds through the hardest league in the world, in the hardest era the game has known, and he did it by setting a standard his teammates had no choice but to follow. Don Revie had built a tough, disciplined Leeds side, but Bremner was the one who lit the fire underneath it every single Saturday. That earned St. John's admiration without any hesitation. George Best is a name that could have gone much higher on this list. The tribal divide between Liverpool and Manchester United was real, but St. John never let club loyalties distort what he saw on the pitch, because what he saw was extraordinary. Anyone could see Best's skill, the balance, the pace, the invention that made him almost impossible to predict. What St. John specifically admired was the bravery. Defenders in the 1960s and early 1970s played the man as much as the ball. A winger who wanted the ball to his feet was inviting a lunge that could end a season, and most of them learned quickly to shield themselves, to stay peripheral, to keep out of real danger. Best went the other way. He wanted contact, wanted to beat the tackle at close range, wanted the confrontation. He'd take a hit that buckled most wingers, get up and go and get the ball again in exactly the same dangerous position, the same defender, the same move, as if the foul hadn't happened. St. John said that kind of deliberate bravery was rarer than any amount of natural ability, that it took something most footballers never found. Best would take the most brutal punishment defenders of that era could legally deliver, get back up, and then go and embarrass the same man again 30 seconds later. That is not talent. That is something deeper, something closer to pride. St. John spoke of Best the way you speak of someone who operated on a frequency most people simply couldn't reach. Two rivals, zero sentimentality, pure respect. From rivals, we move to something more complicated. Men who were both opponents and mirrors. Denis Law, the lawman. If Billy Bremner reflected St. John's fire, Law reflected his entire competitive identity. A fellow Scotsman, a fellow striker, a man who walked onto a football pitch looking for a fight he fully intended to win. At Manchester United, Law was everything. Brave in the air despite being built like a welterweight, electric in the box, and absolutely impossible to bully. The thing about Law in the air was that it made no physical sense. He was lean and not especially tall, yet he won headers against defenders who had 6 inches and 4 stone on him. What he had was timing that bordered on supernatural. He could read the flight of the ball before most players had tracked it, leave the ground at exactly the right moment and get there first. Then he'd flick it, side-foot it, angle it, whatever the situation asked for. Defenders who tried to rough him up found out quickly that Law didn't back down from anything. He put his head in where boots were swinging, got knocked down and came straight back at you. His raised arm, his collar turned up, that particular strut after a goal, all of it told the same story. This is my pitch. Come and take it from me. St. John admired that quality above almost everything else in a footballer. The willingness to pay a physical price for the chance to do something special. Talent without courage, in St. John's view, was just decoration. Law had both, and he wore them without any pretense. For St. John, watching Law play felt like watching his own instincts and fire pushed to a higher level. A mirror, but a sharper one. Bobby Moore is a different kind of entry on this list, because Moore didn't earn his place here through aggression or fire. He earned it through something St. John found genuinely unsettling to play against, an almost inhuman calmness. Moore was the finest defender St. John ever faced, and not because he was the most physical. He never needed to be. Most defenders of that era were physical first and positional second. Moore was the opposite. He'd let you come, let you build up your run, and then be exactly where you didn't want him, arriving at the ball without any apparent rush, without breaking sweat, as if he'd booked the spot an hour earlier. St. John described facing him as a quietly maddening experience. You'd think you'd found the gap, committed to the run, and then Moore was simply there, composed, unhurried, and already moving the ball out before you'd realized what happened. The time you made your run, Moore had already worked out where you were going. By the time you shaped to shoot, he'd positioned himself to take the ball cleanly. St. John said you couldn't beat Bobby Moore. You could only hope he made a mistake. The reason that observation stings is because Moore almost never did. The 1970 World Cup in Mexico, with the tournament barely underway, Moore produced what many still call the greatest defensive performance ever seen in international football. Brazil, Pelé, a full-blooded attack, and Moore was immaculate throughout. His football intelligence made every forward he faced feel slightly less than they actually were. That kind of defender demands respect, not because he hurts you, because he makes you invisible. St. John gave Moore that respect fully and without condition, from the men who tested him on the pitch, the two who shaped everything else entirely. Number 2 on this list is also the man St. John spent the best years of his post-playing life sitting next to. Jimmy Greaves and Ian St. John became Saint and Greavesy on ITV from 1985 to 1992. The show worked because the chemistry was completely real. Two former strikers who'd competed all their careers now sat side by side every Saturday morning, pulling the game apart in plain English. No jargon, no reverence, no careful management of opinion. Just two men who'd lived the game from the inside and weren't afraid to say exactly what they thought. Audiences felt that. You can't manufacture that kind of ease. It either exists or it doesn't. and with Greaves and St. John, it clearly did. But before the television cameras and the banter and the Saturday morning routines, St. John had watched Greaves play football. What he saw left a permanent impression. Greaves was, in St. John's judgment, greatest natural goal scorer Britain ever produced. Not the hardest worker in training, not the most physically imposing figure on the pitch, but put him in front of goal and something happened that St. John struggled to fully explain. A combination of composure, timing and instinct that most players spend their entire careers chasing and never find. Greaves scored 357 goals in top-flight football in England. He did it with a nonchalance that made it look almost accidental, which is, of course, the hardest thing in the world to actually do. Goals that defined him weren't thunderbolts. They were side-footed, placed, slid into corners with the minimum of fuss, as if scoring was less an achievement and more just the natural endpoint of the situation. Defenders hated that. Composure under pressure is coachable to a degree, but what Greaves had went well beyond coaching. It was wired into him. Working alongside him on television only deepened the respect. St. John understood Greaves's football brain up close, the way he read a game during their on-air discussions, the precision of his analysis underneath all the wit and warmth. Greaves could explain in 30 seconds why a move had broken down, tracing it back to a decision made 15 passes earlier. That intelligence wasn't a coincidence. It was the same intelligence that had made him a goal scorer, the ability to read space, read movement, and understand what was coming before anyone else did. Their friendship was genuine, built across years of shared studios and honest conversations. After St. John left the world, tributes made clear just how much Greaves valued what they had built together. He called it the highlight of his life after football. St. John felt exactly the same way. That partnership, that respect, ran much deeper than a television contract. And then there is number one. Number one was never going to be a player. Bill Shankly signed Ian St. John from Motherwell in 1961 for £37,500, time when Liverpool were a second division club with no particular reason to believe the future held anything remarkable. What followed was one of the most complete transformations in British football history, and St. John lived it from the inside. Shankly didn't just coach him, he rebuilt him. From the moment St. John arrived at Melwood, Shankly was talking to him about standards, about the size of what was possible, about the responsibility that came with wearing red. He'd walk through the dressing room before a match, and by the time he left the room, every player in it believed they were about to take the field against a side that didn't have a prayer. That wasn't rhetoric. Shankly meant every word. He had an absolute, unshakable conviction Liverpool were capable of greatness, and that conviction spread like heat through every man around him. The training, the belief, relentless insistence that standards were non-negotiable, the sense that pulling on a Liverpool shirt carried a weight and a meaning beyond anything a pay packet could measure, all of that came from Shankly. By 1964, Liverpool were First Division champions. By 1965, they'd won the FA Cup for the first time in the club's history. A Second Division club in 1961, a dominant force in England by 1966. That isn't a rebuild, that is a reinvention. St. John arrived as a good Scottish striker. He left as a Liverpool legend. That gap was Shankly's work, every inch of it. What stayed with St. John for the rest of his life wasn't the tactics or even the trophies, it was the philosophy. Shankly taught a way of carrying yourself, how to compete, how to lead, how to hold yourself accountable to something bigger than your own career. He taught his players that the supporters weren't spectators, they were participants, part of the same thing, carrying the same weight. That idea changed how St. John played, how he carried himself in big matches, how he understood what football was actually for. St. John measured every coach, every colleague, and every standard he encountered afterward against what Shankly had shown him. Almost nothing measured up. That isn't nostalgia. That is the honest accounting of a man who knew exactly what he'd been given and never took it for granted. St. John called Shankly the greatest figure the British game ever produced. Not for the league titles, not for the cup wins, but for what he built inside the people around him. He turned a struggling second-tier club into a dynasty, and he did it by convincing a group of footballers they were capable of something they hadn't yet imagined. Ian St. John was one of those footballers, and he carried the proof of that his entire life. That, above everything else, is what genuine respect looks like. 8 names, 8 completely different reasons. A strike partner who created the space, a colossus who protected it, rivals who sharpened him, and the man who built him from the ground up. St. John spent 82 years watching this game at the highest level, and this is what that lifetime actually produced. Which name surprised you most? Drop it in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We've got plenty more where this came from.
I'll give you number 2, Stevie. I'll give you number 2. But look, fantastic fullback. Somebody that's held in such high regard in terms of fans and stuff. And you know, I suppose hopefully I can be the second best Scottish fullback at the club, because you know he's a legend.
I am Oliver, and this is Sport Icons. Steve Nicol never had a statue, never had a song written specifically for him, never got the kind of send-off that stops traffic outside a stadium. But ask the men who played alongside him, managed him, or had to stop him, and every single one of them gives you the same answer. He was the best. Not the flashiest, not the loudest, the best. So what was it about this quiet Scotsman that made legends stop and say his name with that particular kind of respect? That's exactly what we're going to find out. Steve Nicol was born in Irvine, Ayrshire in 1961. He didn't come from a club academy in a major city. He came up through Ayr United, a modest Scottish club with no real pipeline to the top of European football. When Liverpool signed him in October 1981, he was 20 years old and walking into one of the most decorated dressing rooms in the world. Kenny Dalglish was already a legend. Liam Souness owned the midfield. Alan Hansen read the game like he'd written the rulebook. And here was Steve Nicol, young lad from Ayrshire trying to find his feet. What he found instead was a standard. Liverpool in the early 1980s didn't tolerate passengers. Every training session was competitive. Every reserve game mattered. The squad expected each player to carry his weight or get out of the way. Nicol absorbed all of it. He didn't shrink from the pressure. He grew into it, slowly and without any of the fanfare that usually surrounds a young talent finding his form. The thing that made Nicol different from the very beginning was his willingness to play anywhere and complain about nothing. Dalglish later described him as the ultimate utility man. Player who could slot into any position and perform at a level that made you forget you'd ever asked him to move. That kind of selflessness is rarer than people think. Most players at that level have a position they consider theirs, a role they've spent years building their identity around. Nicol had no such attachment. The team needed him somewhere, he went there, and he delivered. But it wasn't just positional flexibility that turned heads. From those early years, teammates noticed something in the way he read the game. Hansen would later point to Nicol's positioning as the thing that separated him from ordinary defenders, his ability to be in exactly the right place before the ball even arrived, which meant he almost never needed to make a desperate lunge or a sliding tackle. He made defending look calm, because for him, it largely was. The chip on his shoulder, if he had one, never turned into bitterness. It turned into output. Year after year, match after match, the young man from Ayrshire kept proving he belonged, and eventually there was no argument left to make. Ian Rush knew better than most what it meant to have the right player supporting you from deep. His job was to score goals, and he scored them in extraordinary numbers. Behind a lot of those runs and finishes was Steve Nicol, doing something that rarely shows up on a highlights reel. Nicol's attacking contribution from the right-back position gave Liverpool an extra dimension that opposition teams consistently struggled to plan for. He wasn't just covering his flank and knocking safe passes sideways. He was bursting forward, creating angles and arriving in the box at exactly the right moment. Rush pointed to Nicol's hat-trick against Newcastle United in September 1987 as the clearest example of what the man could do when given the freedom to express himself. 3 goals in a single match from a defender. Not tap-ins, not lucky deflections, 3 genuine contributions from a player who was supposed to be watching the other team's wide men. Rush respected that, called it world-class service. Coming from a striker who had worked with some of the finest players in European football, that wasn't a word he threw around lightly. Graham Souness saw something different in Nicol, though the respect was just as deep. What Souness valued couldn't be measured in goals or assists. It was the engine. 90 minutes on the flank, week after week, season after season. Nicol never ran out of road. He had the physical capacity to defend deep early in a match and still be bombing forward in the last 10 minutes, which meant the midfield behind him could take risks they simply wouldn't have taken with a lesser player on the outside. Souness understood what that security meant. Gave the creative players in the middle license to be creative because they knew the defensive cover was already handled. Nicol was the player who made other players better without ever asking for the credit. John Barnes arrived at Liverpool in 1987 and immediately formed one of the most effective wide partnerships in English football. Barnes on the left, Nicol on the right. Yet it was their relationship down the same flank that Barnes credited most. He talked about what made those years so productive. Nicol's footballing intelligence, Barnes said, is what made the partnership function. Not skill alone, not pace alone, but an instinctive understanding of the game's rhythms that told Nicol exactly when Barnes needed him to overlap, exactly when he needed him to hold his position. Get that wrong once, and Barnes loses the ball in a dangerous area. Get it right every time, and Barnes looks almost unplayable. Nicol got it right almost every time. That kind of intelligence doesn't come from coaching sessions and tactical boards. It comes from watching the game, absorbing information in real time, making decisions faster than most people even recognize a decision needs to be made. Barnes knew what he had beside him, and he knew that without Nicol reading those moments correctly, his own best football wouldn't have been anywhere near as consistent as it was during those years at Anfield. Gary Lineker scored goals against most defenders in England at some points during the 1980s. Against Steve Nicol, it was harder than it looked from the stands. Lineker was one of the most lethal finishers of his generation, a man who found space in areas other forwards never even considered, and he was honest enough in later years to admit that Nicol was among the most difficult one-on-one problems he faced as an opponent. Not because Nicol was particularly aggressive or physical, because Nicol was always there. The positioning that Hansen admired from inside the dressing room was the same quality that drove Lineker quietly mad from the other side. You couldn't drag him out of shape. You couldn't draw him into a chase and then spin away. He was already where you wanted to run before you'd made the decision to run there. That clean, composed style of defending was part of what led to Nicol being named the Football Writers Association Footballer of the Year in 1989. It's worth pausing on that for a second. The FWA award goes to the player that football writers across the country collectively decide represents the best of the game in a given season. Not the most talked about, not the highest scorer, the best. In 1989, the writers looked at every player in English football and landed on a right back from Ayrshire. Lineker understood exactly why. He'd been on the receiving end of it. Sir Alex Ferguson knew Nicol from a different angle entirely. Before the years of confrontation between Liverpool and Manchester United defined so much of English football's narrative, Ferguson had managed Nicol at international level with Scotland. He took that 1986 World Cup squad to Mexico. Nicol was part of it, not as a peripheral squad member, but as someone Ferguson trusted enough to make him a genuine cornerstone of his plans. That trust matters more than it might seem. Ferguson was not a man who handed responsibility to players he had doubts about. In that 1986 squad, surrounded by experienced internationals, Nicol earned a place not through reputation, but through reliability. Ferguson's respect for big game temperament was something he carried his entire career, and Nicol had it in full. Mark Lawrenson played alongside Nicol in that Liverpool defence for several seasons, and the way Lawrenson spoke about him is to something that every other voice on this list circles around. Lawrenson actually named. He said Nicol was a 7 or 8 out of 10 every single week. Not a 9 on his best day and a 4 on a bad one. 7 or 8, week in, week out, regardless of the opponent, regardless of the stakes, regardless of what position he was asked to fill. Lawrenson had played and watched enough football to know how genuinely rare that was. Most players have a ceiling and a floor, and the distance between those 2 points tells you a lot about what they're actually made of. With Nicol, that distance was almost nothing. He didn't have catastrophic games. He didn't need a run of matches to find form after a difficult spell. He simply turned up, performed to an extraordinarily high standard, and left you wondering whether he ever really had a bad day at all. That consistency, when you look at everything these 8 men have said, is the thread running underneath all of it. Dalglish saw it in his willingness to move positions and never complain. Hansen saw it in his positioning. Rush saw it in the goals and the service. Souness saw it in the engine that never stopped. Barnes saw it in the intelligence. Lineker felt it every time he tried to get past him. Ferguson trusted it at a World Cup. And Lawrenson put a number on it. 7 or 8 every single week for years. After the playing days ended, Steve Nicol did something that most decorated footballers from his era didn't do. He crossed the Atlantic and built a second career almost entirely from scratch. In 2002, he took charge of New England Revolution in Major League Soccer. No fanfare, no media circus, no long farewell tour of the English game he'd served so well. He just went to work. What happened over the next decade told you everything the 8 men in this video had been saying about him all along. Nicol took a mid-table MLS side and turned them into something people actually feared. New England reached 5 MLS Cup finals under him. 5. He didn't win them all, which is the fact that tends to get mentioned first, but reaching 5 finals across 9 seasons in a league where parity is built into the structure is a coaching achievement that demands serious respect. Players at Revolution spoke about him the way his Liverpool teammates did, a man who demanded a standard, set it clearly, and held everyone to it without ever making it personal. Taylor Twellman, who played under him at New England, put it plainly when he said that 90 minutes against a Nicol-coached team was pure hell. That was the reputation. Not a gimmick, not a tactical novelty, just a deeply organised, relentlessly hard-working unit that refused to lose games they had no right to win. That philosophy, if you trace it back, was exactly what Graham Souness had valued in him as a player. The engine, the refusal to accept that effort had a limit. Nicol didn't stop running at Liverpool. He didn't allow his teams to stop running in Massachusetts either. The punditry career that followed, primarily built around his work with ESPN in the United States, showed another dimension entirely. Nicol on television is direct, occasionally sharp, and completely unbothered by the idea of upsetting anyone. He'll tell you a player was poor in clear language, will disagree with conventional wisdom, and back it up with specifics. There's no performance in it. He says what he sees, which is exactly what you'd expect from a man who spent 15 years reading the game at the highest level. What's striking, looking at the full arc, is how consistent the character is from beginning to end. The young player who moved positions without complaint at Liverpool became the manager who asked his players to do whatever the team needed, and then became the pundit who said what he genuinely thought rather than what kept everyone comfortable. There's a through line in all of it, a basic indifference to the kind of ego that ruins footballers and managers alike. The 8 legends who've spoken about him in this video noticed it from every angle. Dalglish saw the selflessness, Lawrenson quantified the consistency, Barnes felt the intelligence, Ferguson trusted it at a World Cup, and Lineker felt the quiet frustration of facing someone who'd already solved the problem before you decided to create it. None of them are describing a player who needed the spotlight to function. They're describing someone who made the people around him better week after week simply by doing his job with complete and total reliability. That's a rarer quality in football than a hat-trick against Newcastle, and every one of those 8 men knew it. Football has a habit of forgetting the players who made everything work without demanding recognition for it. The ones who get remembered are the goal scorers, the captains who lifted trophies in slow motion, the characters who gave journalists something to write about. Steve Nicol gave journalists very little to write about, which is probably why his name doesn't land with the same immediate weight as some of the men who've spoken about him here. But strip away the noise and look at what he actually did. 4 league titles with Liverpool, 3 FA Cups, a European Cup, an FWA Footballer of the Year award that went to a right-back because the people who watched every game in England that season couldn't find anyone better. A World Cup appearance with Scotland under one of the most demanding managers the game has ever produced. And then a second career in America that most English football people still don't fully know about, during which he built one of MLS's most consistently competitive sides across nearly a decade. The bittersweet thing, if you're a Liverpool supporter of a certain age, that you probably already knew all of this. You watched him play, you saw what he contributed, and you've spent years slightly puzzled by the fact that the wider football world never quite caught up. 8 legends in this video aren't telling you anything you didn't feel watching him, just confirming it with the authority of people who competed at the same level. What Nicol represents, more than any individual trophy or statistic, is a type of player that football quietly depends on, but rarely celebrates properly. Teams built on 1 or 2 exceptional talents tend to fall apart when those talents have an off day. Teams built on a collective standard, where 6 or 7 players are operating at a 7 or 8 every week without exception, tend to win things year after year. Liverpool in the 1980s were the second kind of team, and Nicol was one of the central reasons why. The men who played with him and against him saw it clearly. What's worth sitting with is the question of whether modern football still produces players like him, or whether the market now demands that every position be filled by someone with a personal brand and the highlights package ready for social media. Because the quality Lawrenson named, that relentless, unremarkable week after week consistency, doesn't generate clips, generates trophies. And there's a difference. Steve Nicol played football the way the game is supposed to be played, for the team at the highest standard he could manage every single time. The legends who faced him and played beside him never forgot what that looked like. If this story reminded you why the unsung ones matter most, hit the like button and subscribe. There are plenty more stories like this one waiting for you. And drop Steve Nicol's name in the comments because he deserves to hear it said more often.